Okay, very good. Thanks, Mike. Okay, recap for Cindy and Sydney and whoever else might be online. We're talking about the high priest tonight, no particular order. Rick talked a lot about the high priest, the tabernacle, and the duties that the high priest had in the tabernacle. That's all online. So it's argued about who the first official high priest was. From the best of what we can understand in Exodus, we have the firm understanding that Aaron was consecrated as the first high priest by Moses. Some biblical scholars, and especially again through Jewish study, that does twist a little bit from what we would call a biblical scholar versus a Jewish scholar. They can reach back as far as Enoch. They talk about Enoch holding a high priestly position, maybe not the classic high priest that we talk about, like when we talk about Aaron. But on from there, they mention Enoch, Methuselah, Lamech, Noah, Shem, Melchizedek, Abraham, Isaac, and Levi. All very important figures. And obviously, as we talk about priestlyhood, we know most of that carries on through the tribe of Levi anyhow. So there's some evidence to that. But as you can see posted here behind me, Aaron was the first person to hold this office. He was appointed by God in Exodus chapter 28, verses 1 and 2. And I have that listed below. Exodus 28 and verse 1 says, "Then bring forward yourself your brother Aaron and the sons of him from among the sons of Israel, and serve as priests to me. Aaron, Nadab, and Abihu, Eleazar, and Ithamar, and Aaron's sons. And you shall make holy garments for Aaron, your brother, for glory and beauty." The second passage there, chapter 29. "Then you shall bring Aaron and his two sons of the doorway of the tent of meeting and wash them in water. And you shall take the garments and put on Aaron the tunic and the robe of the ephod and the breastpiece, and wrap his waist with skillfully woven band of the ephod." So for the most part of what I'm going to talk about tonight, I based it off of those two verses there, or those two sections. I'm mostly going to talk about the consecration, what they had to do to get themselves ready, the significance in their role, and how that was included in what they wouldn't necessarily call their worship service, but what we would consider to be our worship service, their participation in worship and sacrament to God, and then the robes. It really made a big difference in the Old Testament. A lot of these things we could probably parallel to modern day Christianity and religions like the Orthodox Christianity or Catholicism. It's very symbolic. The different pieces of the wardrobe meant different things, and they were important for different reasons, and they had different roles based off what they were wearing, or almost in a sense, what they were wearing had some power to it. Trying to decide how I want to do this here. My notes don't match the PowerPoint. Okay. So succession was really important, and it had a lot to do with the family, right? They were really, really keen on succession for a couple different reasons. Obviously, they wanted to keep it in the family, and the tribe of Levi was really big in the qualifications there. But for the qualifications specifically, there's no distinct Bible verse that we have here. Numbers chapter 4 and verse 3 talks about the age of a Levite and the priesthood being 30 years. A lot of the scholars, again, Jewish scholars, can trace that back a little bit to being around about agreed upon age of 20. So they had to be 20. And they had to be of a legitimate birth, which I thought to be really important, because we really get bogged down in the lineage, and we can pull different things out of the Bible with lineage. We really hold Jesus's lineage pretty highly, so we can trace lineage, clear back to Adam for Jesus's lineage. But it was important to them, because if they couldn't prove their lineage, if their birth wasn't legitimate, then they were disqualified from being priest, and obviously even higher up, the high priest. So the genealogical records were really important. If they couldn't prove that it was legitimate, someone could accuse their mother of being a war spoil, a capture of war, and consequently, further on from that, the priest himself was only allowed to marry an Israelite virgin. Okay, now on to the vestments, meaning the wardrobe. What was really important? So Rick showed this picture when he talked a couple of weeks ago. It's probably been 5 or 6 at this point, but it was really ornate, really complicated, and each one of these different pieces had a little different of a representation, which I thought was neat, but also significant because it meant that there was a rhyme and reason to it. They didn't just have these big, flashy, fancy clothes. And you could talk about different religions of today's day and age, and I'm sure they would give similar answers, but it's pretty easy to get bogged down in the pomp and circumstance, and at very least, they could back up why they did. Well, obviously, it comes down to God's commandments, but we'll go through each one of these pieces here. But the first thing that came to my mind, a little bit of an aside for the high priest, but what's neat about this is you can bring it into modern day relevance, is as soon as I looked at that, I thought about what's called a tzitzit. If you guys have ever seen Fiddler on the Roof, or really Orthodox Jews, if you've ever been to a place like New York City, you'll see people like that walking around. It's not common for people like us to see them, because in the Orthodox, really hardcore Jewish religion that still hold on to that in modernity, they have to be able to walk to temple on the Sabbath, right? So obviously that's not going to be Barnesville, because there's not enough people living in a small enough community to be able to walk somewhere. But there's different communities, big ones in New York, South Florida, California, different places like that. But if you have seen them, pictures of them, or you've seen plays, often you'll see them, they wear the white apron. It's got the little tassels that come off the bottom, right? I got a picture of it here on the corner. And you could kind of draw similarity there. When we talk specifically about the ephod, if I get my magnifying glass to work. There we go. The ephod, right? The apron over top of the robe of the ephod, and then the undergarments. And I'll go through each one of these specifically. But that matches the tzitzit, which is that little tassel they got there. And let's go back. There's another name for it. The tzitzit robe, or prayer shawl, or talit gadol. Obviously, Hebrew doesn't line up with English at all, so apologize if anybody knows better than me and I'm butchering everything. But what was neat to me is, when we try to imagine what we see the high priest in there, it has been passed down from generation to generation in modern Jewish religion. So there is some similarities there. And just like in the Jewish religion, the prayer apron that they wear and the tassels that they wear, that they almost like the Catholics count beads. That's the significance of those tassels. Each piece of the high priest wardrobe had significance. So priests themselves had wardrobes, and the high priest had a significant wardrobe over top of it, right? So the high priest, like all other priests, he would minister barefoot while he was in the temple. I thought that was really neat, because like Moses, for example, when God talked to him at the burning bush, first thing he did was tell him to take off his shoes because he was on holy ground. That was really important for the high priest. And of all the garb that they had to wear, they didn't wear shoes. Really neat. They had to immerse themselves in a ritual bath. A lot of stuff that Rick talked about. They had to be clean and cleansed over and over and over again. And if they didn't do this properly, they didn't have the right authority, or their rituals and the worships and the sacraments, they were all for naught. The Talmud, again, more of Jewish history, less of the Old Testament, but it teaches that they weren't fit to minister unless they were wearing these garments, right? So again, you can kind of see that in modernity. You'll see a priest walk around with a collar on, even when he's in his quote-unquote street clothes. He still has some kind of sign to say that he was a priest. It's not a Catholic lesson, but just a little, not coincidence, but a little connection that I drew there. So they weren't fit to be priests, or they weren't priests. If they weren't wearing the clothes, they weren't filling the role, and they lost their, a lot of the records that I found here, they referred to it as power. They lost their priestly power, which some of that had to do with political aspects, but obviously the physicality of it as well. Okay, let's go through the quote unquote vestments, or all the different pieces they had to wear. So keep this in mind. I don't have the picture up while we go through each one of these, but they had a multi-piece turban, right? A hat with fine linen on top, and then there was a gold plate that held it together. The ephod itself was just many different portions of their vest, essentially. So it had shoulder straps, a breastplate, stones inside the breastplate, the little prayer smock, like I talked about, the Jews having nowadays. The stones, we'll talk about those. The gold, we'll talk about that. Underneath the ephod, they had a sleeveless tunic, for all intents and purposes. The Old Testament calls it a tunic in several different places. And then under that, the long sleeve white part that you see, which goes clear down to the bottom underneath the tassels that they had, was essentially undergarments. So this was really complicated. Many different layers to this vestment that they had. and each one had significance, right? So even the undergarments or their underwear, or the white part you can see, you know, it's probably what we imagine most everybody was wearing back then. This is the classic toga tunic, something like that. Exodus 28 and 42 says they had to wear that part to cover their nakedness specifically. The tunic itself, again, had to be made of pure linen, covered the entire body from neck to feet. Important because the ephod itself left a lot of places open. So the undergarment was to cover everything entirely up. They were barefoot, but the tunic went from feet all the way up to their neck, with the sleeves, obviously, because the other piece was a vest. The high priest's version of that tunic was embroidered, and the priests themselves were plain. So everything about the high priest was just one step further than the priest to show their significance. And again, back then it did have some vestment to their power, right? It's not only set them aside and made them look different, but it was important. They had to wear sash. That of the high priest, again, was of fine linen. It was embroidered. The colors were really important. So of commoners and of the lower priests, the colors weren't quite as important. A lot of times it was just white. But with the high priest, blue, purple, and scarlet were really important. And again, those worn by regular priests or lower priests, not the high priest, they were white, twined linen. So fine linen, red, purple, blue, purple, and scarlet, and then lower priests were white. Again, they had a turban, 2 pieces on that one. That of the high priest was much larger than that of the other priests, and it was wound so that it formed a broad, flat-topped turban. For the lower priest, it was wound so that it formed a cone-shaped turban. So again, shape looked different. Migbat is the Hebrew word for that. Going on down, the robe of the ephod that they had to wear, that was the sleeveless, the tank top part of the overcoat that they had. It was blue. The lower hem was fringed with small golden balls, and then they had pomegranate-shaped tassels, alternating in color. The ephod itself was very richly embroidered, vast upon the apron, with 2 onyx engraved gemstones on the shoulders. The top part we talked about, those were engraved with the names of the tribes of Israel. The breastplate had 12 gems, again, 1 for each of the tribes, and fastened to the ephod, that was with gold, fastened with gold. And again, this one I really found neat. On the front of the turban, so the first and foremost piece of the entire outfit was engraved holiness to. In modern study, they're really hanging on to this YHWH, which I've studied in it in Hebrew. It just means Yahweh, right? So I'm not sure if it's just a translation into the language, but obviously the Hebrew word for God. So of all the words, the embroiderments of everything going on in the outfit, first and foremost, right there in the middle of his forehead was holiness to Yahweh. So God's first and foremost there. The high priest did have 2 sets of garments, golden garments. These were important for the Day of Atonement. So Gary asked me to talk about the Day of Atonement, and I didn't realize that till a minute ago. And here's your 30 seconds on the Day of Atonement. So when the high priest, on the special day when he was allowed to go into the most holy place and all the rituals he had to go through to purify himself to get in the back, he actually did have different outfits. He had to go into the most holy place 2 different times. Each time he went in, he had to change outfits. One was, if I remember correctly, one was more of white, one was more gold. I'll have to study a little more on that. But he did have to change outfits each time he went into the most holy place. Consecration. So there's an initial consecration when they become priestly or when they become ordained as priests. But again, a lot like Rick talked, every time they perform their duties and every day, every time they stepped in and out of the temple, in and out of the tabernacle, it was important that they reordained, for more or less. For all intents and purposes, they had to be reappropriated, repurified, recleansed. They had to get prepared every time. It was very, very ritualistic. God had them do it in very specific ways. And I mean, they couldn't give up on it. They did give up on it. There were lots of things that I found about essentially scandal and accusations and jail time, or worse. So bad things happened when they wouldn't follow specifically. Obviously, the rest of the Jewish nation took it as seriously as the high priest was supposed to. But specifically talking about being consecrated, where they really give the line to the first high priest being Aaron, was that we see that Aaron was anointed with sacred oil. And that's where we find the word anointed priest. Restrictions. These I found to be really interesting. So the high priest is not supposed to follow the bier or coffin, what we would call coffin casket of one of his own family who had died, and he's not supposed to leave the temple or his own house during the time of mourning. Typically, his house was either very adjacent to or attached to the temple. People, and I think you can kind of draw some connections into modern day when we talk about Jewish religion. A lot of times people will go to their house in mourning and they'll sit there for 4 or 5 days. And I think that kind of draws back into some of the commandments we see in the Old Testament here. So they weren't allowed to leave the temple. They had to sit there and mourn in their own house, and people came to them. It was important how they looked. Their hair wasn't allowed to be disheveled. They weren't allowed to cut it. Again, the house was supposed to be attached to the temple or very adjacent to the temple. And his honor required that he should spend nearly all of his time at the house of the temple. He wasn't really supposed to go anywhere else. Specifically in the time of mourning, it was mentioned he wasn't allowed to leave at all. But for the most part, if you're going to the temple, the priest is supposed to be there, the high priest is specifically. He was subject to the jurisdiction of different courts, but he had a lot of pull in it. I'm not saying there's any kind of corruption there, but what he said mattered more than what a lot of other people said. So there were instances where they were accused and convicted for all intents and purposes. But as we can see in other places in the Bible, with the way the Pharisees and the Sanhedrin and the politics intermixed with the Jewish religion, the high priest would have a lot of pull and a lot of sway in that. I didn't spend a lot of time talking about the Sanhedrin or the Pharisees, because a lot of what I found was outside the Bible and I didn't want to get too far out. The high priest must be married, and he should marry only a virgin to guard against contingencies. It was proposed that he hold a second wife at readiness immediately before the Day of Atonement. So if the high priest, or if there was any question that something was going to happen to his wife, the Day of Atonement was coming up, they didn't necessarily want him to have more than one wife, but if she was going to die at or right before the Day of Atonement, he had a second wife ready, one in the pocket, ready to go. Not very nice for the women, but that's kind of how it was back then. Really interesting for me, and I thought this was neat, because like I just said, in the Old Testament and back in those times, women didn't really have a whole lot of say in things. But I read a lot about the process called, let me get it right, Yibum. We'll hold on to that one. And we've read about this in the Old Testament without knowing all the Hebrew words. When your brother's wife dies without having children, you have a responsibility to that wife, right? And from what I could read, the women actually had a lot of say in this. I don't think they ever really went against it, but the women did have the option to back out of that, right? So for the most part, we see the women holding the men to that, because that was a very small power that women had over men back then. However, the priest was allowed to initiate halaza, which was his trump card over top of that, right? So he did not have to marry his brother's wife and carry on his brother's seed, whereas the rest of the Jewish nation was supposed to. Now, I'm going to read a little bit about that, because the process, I think, is kind of cool. Very symbolic, as the rest of the Old Testament was. But the process involves the widow making a declaration. This is if the widow decides, right? Not the high priest in particular. But if the widow decides, it's a process involving her making the declaration by taking off the shoe of the brother, or the presumed new husband, the brother of the late husband. She spits on the floor, and through this ceremony, this brother and all the other brothers are released from the bond of this yibum and the Levite marriage. So I thought that was really cool. And we can find instances of this in Deuteronomy 2 and 5 through 10, or excuse me, 25, 5 through 10. I'm gonna need my glasses adjusted. Find a good doctor. Yeah, maybe. So for the most part, that was in the women's hands, but the priest did ultimately have the trump card as far as that. So he didn't have to hold on to his brother's wife. I think a lot of this came because they really discouraged polygamy with the priests, whereas, all the rest of the Old Testament, we see that's really prolific, but it wasn't exactly something they wanted. However, they despised not having a wife even more so. For instance, the Day of Atonement, he had a second wife ready to go. More restrictions. Again, he must be married. He should only marry a virgin. We talked about that. For some reason, I have that same slide twice. Never mind. In succession. We talked a little bit about this in the beginning, but the succession is supposed to be through one of his sons, and it was to remain in his own family. We see that in Leviticus. If he had no son, the office was devoted to the brother next of age, a lot like we see like British royalty, for example. It's really, for the most part, they try to keep it straight down in the blood as possible. Leviticus 6:14 through 15 says, now this is the law of the grain offering. The sons of Aaron shall present it before the Lord in front of the altar, and then one of them shall lift up from it a handful of fine flour to the grain offering, and its oil and the incense that on the grain offering he shall offer it up smoke to the altar, a soothing aroma, as it's a memorial offering to the Lord. That wasn't the best parallel, but that was the best verse I could find. Again, a lot of the authority came outside of the Bible, and I tried to pull as many Bible verses as I could. There's a lot more about the high priest, but long story short, the high priest was really important. He was the only guy that could go into the most holy place, and he was only allowed to do it on one day of the year. It was really important, the way that he looked, the way that he acted, the way that he dressed, the way he conducted himself, the way his family acted. Everything had to be very decent, in order, very consecrated, very ordained. His wardrobe really mattered. Old Testament was really different from what we see in the New Testament. Anybody have any questions? Can't promise you an answer. Okay, very good. Thank you for your attention. I'll pass it back over to Gary. Good question. He wasn't allowed to cut his hair. I didn't see anything about beards. All the pictures have beards. And we read the verses about not being allowed to cut the corners of your beards, and that's why all the Amish do. I don't have a good answer for that, but I imagine there's something in there somewhere. I would venture to say they probably weren't supposed to cut them, but I don't have a verse to quote that for. Good question. Anybody else? Thank you much.
Thank you very much.